the industry, pollution becomes an idealized form of landscape. It's an amazing trick. They take the absolute worst thing and make it appealing. You take what you think would be black and you sell it as white. Amazing flip that happened about 30 or 40 years ago. And we all somehow swallowed it because the pictures looked really nice. This inversion in our appreciation has deeply affected our perception and understanding of the environment and relegated our two original landscape archetypes that I've been teaching you for the last semester back into the distant past. I mean, here, I think that it's really difficult to talk about an archetypal reference. We can talk about fragments, we can talk about surfaces, but I think that coming in and sort of pathetically placing a circle on that, or even a walled garden on a terrain that doesn't even have earth to grow anything, and let alone eat whatever we're growing there, poses a problem. Really poses a problem. However, terrain vague is by no means a new phenomenon. It's been going on for a while. What I find amazing in this picture of West Princeton is that you see a summer holiday camp on the top. The Dutch are enjoying their holiday on the beach. They all have their very economical tents. And they're parked right in front of what we call slackies, probably from a water treatment center, these muds that come from the water treatment. So they're piled there. And this is again a picture from West Princeton. These are just normal landscape pictures from the Netherlands that you probably don't see in your tourist guides. But West Princeton has done a very interesting series of this material. And I think that what's interesting here is that you realize all of a sudden, I'm here sort of telling you this is not aesthetic, but obviously to a lot of people, certainly not only to the adults, but to the kids growing there, this is going to be a place of memory. It's going to be a place where some people have fun. And there's a sort of acceptance. There's an acceptance of that. Therefore, I don't want you to start thinking that we're going to be moral and we're going to say, oh, let's escape, and I'll talk about Prince Charles in a few minutes. Let's escape with Prince Charles up to Balmoral in Scotland and forget about the rest. I think it's really about sticking our nose in the stuff and understanding how we can best react to that and best have things evolve. So, the newness of the phenomenon is recent, probably as old as photography. These are very old pictures, some of the first photographs by Marville in Paris, showing sort of the slums and the demolitions during the Haussmannian projects, where you sort of terrain vague appear and get aestheticized. I think that is really an important point, this reference to the way we take a distance to the terrain. I mean, it's just the way I'm talking to you. It would be very different if I took you on a garbage heap. It's one thing showing you these pictures of that. The terrain vague was elevated already at that time to the highest echelon of a sort of form of poetic representation. They depicted Paris under transformations with as much vigor and persuasion as American wilderness pictures. Photography was used in many different ways in the 19th century, and when you read Simon Schama's book, Landscape of Memory, I think you all should, he very clearly talks about the invention of photography as a device to promote different ideas of landscape. And clearly Marville is showing terrain vague, and the other extreme probably is the famous pictures by Ansel Adams that were taken at Yosemite on beautiful silver prints. And you have to understand that the Americans created the national park movement out of these photographs. These photographs were printed, bound into books, and sent to the House of Representatives in Washington. And the pictures were on the table, and people flipped through those pictures and voted the creation parts. And in the same way, this photography of the terrain vague is anchoring, in a way, another form of aesthetic reference in a whole series of developments that are going to follow. I'm going to try and explain that one in the argument a little bit further. You've probably seen these pictures many times. I know that Philippe Bushman talks about them, but I will talk about them again myself. The very famous Passaic pictures. Passaic is an industrial suburb of New Jersey, on the other side from Manhattan, New York. When Smithson had finished his stay in Rome, he came back to his hometown of Passaic and decided to go out into Passaic with a little camera and to take pictures of the river and the landscape as if he was in Rome. The only difference was that he wasn't in Rome, he was in Passaic. He just took pictures of what he saw. He just recorded what he was seeing. And the important thing with this approach is that it's almost a century after Marvin. Marvin was in the 1850s, this is in the 1960s, so we're talking about a long distance. But what is important in that, and I think you should not underestimate that, the trend set by this artist, and probably later on in Switzerland, artists like Fishing Weiss, etc., tended to aesthetize, to give an aesthetic connotation to something which did not belong to any tradition. It was more based on the observation of a deed, and it turned out to be considered an art form. So the photographs of the land artist Robert Smithson, taken on the Passaic River in New Jersey a century later, elevated the most despicable views of industrial decrepitude and environmental dejection to the rank of picturesque plasticity and amusement. It's also very ironic that the Passaic landscapes that he depicted no longer exist. They made a very nice promenade for bicyclists and dogs with a couple of trees now. It's all cleaned up. And the terrain vague, in a way, through this sort of whole history of photography and art, became a sort of embodiment of an aesthetic in itself. That's what I'm trying to get to. That's why it breaks away from any reference to Rome, any reference to archetypes, any reference to past history. It's about the here and now, the sort of optical acceptance of the condition. So with the force of photographic and filmic depiction, the terrain vague aesthetic transgressed all national boundaries and became, with its potent form of nihilism, the visceral symbol of the globalized aftermath of modernity, not modernity. Sorry about that. And that's why the Smithsonian has had such a success, not just in Passaic or in New York or, it's had a global success. This has had a global success because basically everybody recognizes their nest there. Right? He was looking at these as wonderful cascades. It's in Renaissance gardens. And if you look at these pictures that go beyond that, these are pictures in the Lausitz, Espenhain, the brown coal mines of eastern Germany, you realize that the sort of aesthetic form here, it's a beautiful picture. You have the classical diagonal, I can almost have a golden section here. The whole composition, the way I'm serving you the terrain vague on plate is perfect. It could be a cannon, it could be a Rembrandt composition with that famous diagonal. The tires could be people's heads, a few grasses in the back. But what I'm seeing, if I tell you the story of this is not far away from Johann Sebastian Bach's native village. And this is probably where his ancestors were buried. The only difference is in between the time that the ancestors of Johann Sebastian Bach were buried and now there was a Second World War with a real pressure on energy, on petrol and on coal. And Germany had no choice but to go in and excavate 200 meters down in the ground through the glacial sands all the brown coal they could get, the lignite. That's the result. The history has been reduced to pure powder, you know? And some people could say, well, there is, and Vietnam says that, it's the far west. You can probably rent ponies and horses and just gallop through like John Wayne. I mean, it's a change of landscape, it's a change of attitude. Now, of course, the engineers were smarter than that because there is a risk of death there, the landslides, the lavina. You probably would lose roughly 10 people a year, probably less than a weekend driving in Germany, but it brought in huge budgets to restore, so to speak, the landscape. Not by landscape architects, just by engineers. But I think that's important. You have to understand that this could not have happened, or at least the sort of aesthetic acceptance of this disaster could not have happened without that history of the picture. Now, going back to this image of Smithson again, to talk about this sort of ecological upheaval, sort of nihilistic means nil, zero, the nihilist of the forces of the zero, of the nothing. The nihilistic forces embodied by the Terranvags question the very roots and purpose of aesthetic values in prevailing cultures of landscape. We're burning all our books. You know, when you take the Terranvag and you take all the wonderful books you have, this is a very interesting sketch, exercise by Robert Smithson, I'm sure you've heard about that, where he talks about heaps of language. It's this idea, what was the purpose of all this history? I mean, in a way, I'm sort of annihilating the last semester and telling you, what's the use of all this stuff if we basically come to a sort of powder, if the world has come to just a surface of unusable powder. What is the use of all this stuff? How can it be brought back into the picture? And I think that is a very, very critical question, theoretical question. You may have your opinions on that. But some of you may think, hey, this is super cool. I'm just going to go in with my motorbike and just go for it until gasoline runs out. You know? It's okay. I'm not making a value judgment. I'm just saying, what's your position? And how do you base your position? What is it based on? Right? I mean, of course, you're all very comfortable when you see the animal atoms. But that's absolutely classical, in a way, nature propaganda. It's talking about this Urnatur, right? This other world. The Americans were smart enough to preserve these pieces in the 1870s, 1880s. But it's a fact that these worlds cannot be regenerated. They can only be preserved, and if they've been destroyed, they do not come back, or at least they don't come back in the same form. As an indirect result, the plethora of artistic and philosophical interpretations on the Terranvag, and there's an abundant literature on that, I encourage you to look at these two terms together when you research, combined to a growing environmental advocacy under the banner of ecology, provoked a very deep schism in the world of landscape architecture and design at the onset of the 1970s. We just had a brilliant thesis by Annette Freitag, who is in Hanover today, Chr Gir, who analyzes very precisely this period of the 70s with my predecessor Kinas, doing his doctoral work in Kassel with Lucius Burkhardt. Very important ideological moment where all of a sudden the landscape architect is told, drop your pencil, just look at spontaneous weeds growing in the city. Kinas mapped the movement of weeds through the city, through the cracks in the pavement. That's what he did his doctorate on. He was looking at how plants move on their own through the city. There's a whole philosophy, there's a whole attitude towards nature, which is also linked to the 1930s and the war, which explains this whole evolution and this sort of negation of design. In the midst of this ideological upheaval, some militant landscape architects let go of their secular design tradition and poised suddenly, they presented themselves suddenly, as self-proclaimed environmental healers. I'm going to heal your environment. I'm going to save your planet. You know, great marketing strategy. And of course also social healing at the same time, by the objective evidence of the natural science. And I think it's really important to hear that. All of a sudden, the design profession gets substituted with a sort of scientific or pseudo-scientific evidence which enables change. The most famous book is Design with Nature, done by Ian McCarr, Penn, and partly also Kevin Lynch. And the reason why I'm talking about Kevin Lynch, even though he did the urban design, he trained people like Carl Steinitz, who took over the whole environmental planning department at Harvard afterwards. It was about a sort of very systematic, universal approach to solving problems. And Design with Nature by McCarthy is a system which basically allowed the generation of the whole GIS system, which is a system of mapping overlays, right? Where you look at environmental conditions, and depending on how the overlay works, you basically find solutions. A sort of systematic, scientific approach to landscape rather than a design approach. Okay, we're going to take a little break now, but I think that Johannes wants to come and talk to you. So I'm going to try and rush through very quickly and do this. Just hang on 1 minute. If you would like to make a little bit of an announcement.
Ja, hallo, eigentlich meine Ankündigung richtet sich an alle, die sich noch nicht für ein Wahlfach eingeschrieben haben. Und zwar haben wir in unserem Wahlfach Landscape-Video noch ein paar Plätze frei. Wir befassen uns mit der Wahrnehmung der Landschaft und werden in diesem Semester mit der Videokamera in der Stadt Zürich Orte untersuchen zum Thema Gelbe Leere, also der schönen Aussicht. Es geht uns darum, Orte wahrzunehmen, an denen wir normalerweise vorbeigehen und diese neu entdecken. Ja, falls wir diese geweckt haben und Sie noch Fragen haben, ich werde in der Pause hier anwesend sein.